Hi everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ. John chapter 19, part 2. We're picking up in verse 16. And where we've been so far is that Jesus has been on trial. The Jews are really putting the pressure on Pilate to give up Jesus and to condemn him, let them crucify him. And he's finally at his breaking point. So that's where we're picking up. Let's read verse 16 and 17. So he delivered him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is in Aramaic Golgotha, or which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. You know, if you haven't watched part 1, you should definitely do that, because this is what giving into temptation looks like. This is a great, well, not a great, but this is a perfect picture of it. You know, Satan and the Jews that were working for Satan, they just wore Pilate down. He knew he shouldn't give Jesus over, but he also knew that, well, that was the easy road to take. And so they finally wear him down enough. He grew weary in fighting for what was right. And this is something that Christians are warned about. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul writes, and he tells the Christians there, brothers, do not grow weary in well-doing, because we get tired of waking up every day and fighting in the Lord's army and having to wage war against our passions and our desires and doing things that are wrong and acting in ways that we shouldn't to make our lives easier in the moment, right? So we're always at war, and Paul says, don't grow weary in doing this. That's exactly what happens to Pilate. He's weary. And he takes the easy road and he falls in line with the world. So much application here for us. This is similar to the offer that the devil makes us, right? Stop living as part of the minority. Pilate's in the minority right now. Stop fighting your desires. Stop denying yourself. Stop supporting things that are going to make people dislike you. You don't need to wake up every day and fight a war. You can be at peace here and now. And you don't need to be wear yourself out working for the Lord. So just come over here, join us, and your life is going to get a whole lot easier. That's the offer. There's a scene. This reminded me of a scene in a movie. I don't know if you've ever seen Jason and the Golden Fleece. Sometimes it's Jason and the Argonauts. When I was younger, we were homeschooled, and we used to go to the library and get like all these old movies from like the 50s, 60s, you know, that time, Charlton Heston and those other guys. And this was one of the movies we watched. And in that movie, Jason is on this quest to become king. He has to find the Golden Fleece. And after their first kind of early on, they've encountered some danger, and one of their first stops is the island of Limnos. And Limnos is an island that is entirely populated by beautiful women. And the Argonauts, or Jason's men, they quickly become enchanted by these women, and they start finding themselves girlfriends, and they also start finding reasons why they don't need to leave, that they can just stay there forever. And the women employ all kinds of tactics to keep them there, with wine and pleasure and, you know, you can imagine. And so they're faced with this choice. They can sail off into the rough sea with little food, with a damaged boat, and with the discomfort of knowing that they've already been promised that their voyage is going to be dangerous, but they're sailing into who knows what, right, in order to accomplish this quest. So it's that versus staying on this island that's full of attractive women where there's plenty of food and no immediate danger. You can kind of see the temptation there. But if you stay, or if they stayed, they're never going to complete their quest. Yeah, and God and Jesus are very clear that Christians have been given a quest. They've been given a responsibility. And they've been also very clear about the fact that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. There's going to be difficulty in that. But it's necessary, and it's the greatest purpose that any human being can employ themselves in. So Satan is going to try to convince you to stay on Limnos and to abandon the quest that God has given you, to enjoy the pleasure and the ease and the union of, or that comes with being in union with the world. You know, another application here is that the wording of verse 16 is interesting. It says that he, or Pilate, delivered Jesus over to them. They're saying, surrender Jesus. We'll be happy with you when you surrender Jesus. And that's really the same situation that we find ourselves in. The world says, you know, you just give up Jesus, we'll accept you. Just get rid of that guy. Don't let him be in charge of your life anymore. Don't live for the things that he tells you to live for, and you can be on our side. And that's what Pilate does. And part of the reason I pull that application out is because I think we can often feel like we're really far removed from Pilate. Like his temptations are not our temptations, and we would never give up Jesus. But the temptations are actually really, really similar. And a lot of us, being in that situation, probably would have done the same thing. Jesus carried his own cross to the place of his crucifixion, at least part of the way. Mark's gospel tells us that a man named Simon of Cyrene was recruited to help Jesus carry his cross. And Cyrene is a place in North Africa, and it's likely that Simon would have come to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. And sometimes we might get the idea that it must have been an honor to carry Jesus' cross for him. But you think about it at that time. Here's a convicted criminal. Simon probably doesn't know a whole lot about him. And a Roman soldier makes him associate himself with this convicted criminal and carry his cross. Wouldn't have been a good look, really. Probably not something he was thrilled about. Now, the cross was heavy and would have been a burden. Some people think that the vertical beam of the cross could weigh up to 300 pounds. And you can imagine that from some of the pictures that you've seen. The crossbar, that was also known as the, I can't remember the name, but I have it down further in my notes, so we'll get it down there. Like the cross beam could have weighed, 100 pounds. And that might have been a manageable load for Jesus most days. But he had already been flogged, he'd already been beaten, he'd already had a sleepless night, so that would have been like an impossible burden probably at that point. No one knows the exact location of Golgotha, at least 100%. There is a location outside the walls of Jerusalem that's kind of the commonly accepted location, and it was originally identified in around 325 BC, AD, 325 AD, by Helena, who was Constantine's mother. You might have heard about Constantine in church history. She was actually really, really active in the later years of her life, hunting down these important Christian religious sites and also Christian relics. She was really into that. And whether or not all of her finds were 100% accurate, that's to be debated. But there is a commonly accepted spot. And you can see from the picture there that some of the holes in the cliff line kind of give you like a face. You can see the two eyes and the mouth there in that picture. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of people think it was. Verse 18. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. First I want to take a drink. I wanted to go into a little bit of the medical, scientific, historical background of the crucifixion here, and I think I'm going to add to this when we go into Luke as well, and that'll be the most comprehensive study of it. But I wanted to include some of that here that we haven't had in the Matthew and Mark studies. Crucifixion was a form of capital punishment, and it involved nailing a criminal to a wooden cross and then elevating them in the air in a number of different possible positions. And it was done so that checking my camera. Oh, okay, I know what it's doing. Sorry. A person could be crucified in various different ways, and it was meant to maximize the humiliation of the one who was being crucified and to dissuade any onlookers from participating in their same crime. The term crucifixion could refer to, as I just mentioned, a number of different ways of killing somebody, all involving, a stake or a piece of wood. So it could be being hung on a crossbeam and nailed like Jesus had been. It could also be being tied to a crossbeam like that. It could be just being nailed to a tree, like a living, tree. Sometimes there were also people who were crucified just on the vertical beam, almost like a telephone pole, as we would think about it, and their hands were nailed above their head. Crucifixion could also refer to people being impaled on a stake, which is not a pretty picture. I think the Assyrians were really notorious for doing that. Seneca, who was an ancient writer, he wrote this about crucifixion. He says, "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground, some impale their private parts, and others stretch out their arms on the gibbet." Peter was crucified upside down, according to Christian tradition. There are a few inaccuracies that we often see in modern depictions of crucifixion, and I just want to pull out a few of those and bring those up. Those who were crucified were typically crucified naked. When you see a picture of Jesus crucified, he often has like a loincloth on or something covering him. Probably wasn't the case. He was probably crucified naked. And again, it was meant to maximize shame, and that would certainly do it. Another thing that is somewhat inaccurate is that the placement of the nails in the hands, and you might have heard of this before. The nails were probably not placed in the palm of the hand as is generally depicted. They're probably inserted down around like the wrist area. Then you might say, well, the Bible says they were in the hands, and so that would be a contradiction. It wouldn't be a contradiction because the Greek word that's actually used there for hand can refer to the fingertips all the way down to the elbow. So any of that is kind of fair game. That's the way that they referred to it. Not in our modern sense of hand. That would be like the palm up to the fingertips. And the reason they think that was the way of doing it was because the palm would actually not support the weight of a person's body when they were being lifted up onto the cross or hanging on the cross, most likely. So, but it would if it was in the wrist. Another thing that might be a little bit inaccurate is in most of the movies, Jesus' hands and feet are nailed to the cross while the cross is laying on the ground and then he's lifted up. That may not have been the way that it was done. We know that in some cases, the victim's hands were nailed to the crossbeam, and that is known as the patibulum. There you go. That's that name I was looking for earlier. The crossbeam is the patibulum. And while they were on the ground, the victim's hands would be nailed to that crossbeam. But then that crossbeam would be lifted up into the air, hoisted with ropes or by soldiers or something like that. Then when they were hoisted, their feet would be nailed onto the crossbeam. So when they were suspended just by all the weight was on those nailed wrists, right? And there's an article written by APU. It's on apu.edu's site, university, and they wrote this article called "The Science of the Crucifixion." And I want to read 2 sections from this article. It says, once the victim is secured, the guards lift the crossbeam and place it on the vertical beam already in the ground. As it is lifted, Jesus' full weight pulls down on his nailed wrists, and his shoulders and elbows dislocate. In this position, Jesus' arms stretch to a maximum of 6 inches longer than their original length. So there's so much weight on your wrists when this happens, it's possible that your shoulders and your elbows dislocate. And they're saying that could cause your arms to be 6 inches longer than they generally are, which is, that's a huge length for your arms to be extended. And they reference Psalm chapter 22, verse 14 there that talks about something similar. Psalm 22 has all kinds of parallels for the crucifixion, even some that aren't mentioned in John. Following this, when someone was crucified, they were given what was called a titulus or a titulus. I'm not sure which way it's pronounced. And that titulus was a sign that bore the criminal's name and then bore the criminal's crime, so that everyone would be able to see, who they were and what they had done. How long a person remained on the cross depended on several factors. Number one would be like just the person's physical condition, then maybe how badly they had been flogged, whether a person was nailed or whether a person was tied to the cross, whether the attending soldiers decided they were going to expedite their death or they were just going to let them hang there as long as they could possibly survive. And the soldiers expedited deaths by breaking the criminal's legs so they couldn't breathe, also stabbing them in the heart and killing them. Also, soldiers would sometimes light fires at the bottom of the cross, and then the smoke from that fire would rise up and suffocate the individual that was hanging there, who was already having, labored breathing. Some people hung on the cross for hours, and then some people hung on the cross for days. Verse 19 through 22. I also want to add, I want to add something that I don't have in my notes here, and that is that crucifixion was generally only for like the lower classes of Roman society. And there's actually quite a few Roman historians who write about crucifixion, and they're kind of detested by it. Like, it was even too gruesome and brutal for a lot of, civilized society. The Romans did a lot of things, but this was one that was not looked on kindly by, I guess, the sophisticated classes, the higher classes, and many of them write about it almost contemptuously. There you go. Another thing I saw was there's only one recorded survivor of crucifixion, at least in the historical record. We talked about in Matthew chapter 24 the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Well, Titus crucified a lot of the Jews who were caught there, and Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who was kind of working for the Romans, he was there, and he was walking around, and he saw three of his friends or people that he knew who had been crucified, and he went and told Titus, the general, and he was real sad. And Titus had them pulled off the cross, and two of them died because of their injuries, but one of them actually survived, and so he's the only survivor, at least, that's recorded, that's written down, that we know of, that I know of. Verse 19 through 22. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And many of the Jews read the inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am the King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So Jesus' titulus, that sign, gave his name, Jesus of Nazareth, and his crime, or his supposed crime, that he was the King of the Jews. And I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting that Pilate wrote something that was true, because Jesus was the King of the Jews. I think it's also interesting that, 1,000 years earlier, the Israelites, the Jews, had rejected God as their king. They said, we want an earthly king. We want a man to be our king. And God had said, okay, I'll give you a man to be your king. And that led the Jewish nation on a 1,000-year journey of terribleness, where these kings steered their nation into all kinds of trouble, and there were very few kings who actually even did a halfway decent job. And you would think that the Jews would have learned at this point that, wow, we should go back to that king who led us out of Egyptian slavery and led us into a promised land and gave us a land of our own. We should probably think about going back to that king who was God. But here, when given the opportunity again 1,000 years later, they reject God again. They didn't want Jesus to be their king. They didn't want to give God back his throne. Not that they could stop him, but they rejected him again. They hadn't learned the lesson. So when we think about this concept of the kingdom of heaven in Matthew's gospel, he's always talking about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is for those who do want God to be their king, who have looked back at the Old Testament and who have learned the lesson that it's teaching. They've learned that God is the only one capable king who's going to be on the throne forever, who's never going to let you down, who always has your back, is going to be able to protect you, who's going to secure you in this life and in eternity, right? And they want him to be their king. And so that's the invitation. Join, be a part of the kingdom of God. The Jews objected to what Pilate had written. They wanted it changed, and Pilate told them he wasn't going to change it. He was fed up with these people at this point, and he said what he had written, so it remained as it was. Verse 23 and 24. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also a tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. And so they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to see whose it shall be." Excuse me. This was to fulfill the scripture which said, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things. Apparently the belongings of the crucified people belonged to the soldiers who did the crucifying. So they took Jesus' garments and they divided them into 4 parts. Now, when they came to his tunic, they recognized that it was a seamless garment, which would have been somewhat unusual. But they decided that instead of tearing it apart, they were going to cast lots for it, which seemed like a game of chance, almost like drawing straws or rolling dice or flipping a coin, something to that effect. And that it was just kind of a way of a random chance game to decide a winner. We know that sometimes God used it for his own purposes, but here it's just kind of whoever draws the long straw gets the garment. Jesus' tunic, as I said, was unique in the fact that it was seamless. Most tunics in those days were made from 2 pieces of fabric being sewn together. And there's actually a church, I think it's in Europe, I think it's a Catholic church, that claims to have this garment. And it stays like in a locked box, but every 7 years or something like that, they get it out, and you can make a pilgrimage there to see Jesus' seamless garment. So, in case you want to take a pilgrimage, I have some questions as to whether it's authentic or not, but if you Google it, you'll find it pretty quickly. The question that I have about it is there symbolism in the fact that Jesus' garment is seamless and that it wasn't torn? Some people make a lot of this, and then some people make nothing of it, and I'm not ready to say for sure. I want to say perhaps at this point. And I want to tell you, I want to give you the reason for my perhaps. Is there any suspicion that this might be symbolic? Well, maybe. The fact that Jesus is wearing a seamless garment is interesting because although the Bible doesn't tell us, Josephus, that Jewish historian, he tells us that the high priest's garments were seamless. He writes in his book, Antiquity of the Jews, "Now this vesture was not composed of 2 pieces, nor was it sewn together upon the shoulders and the sides, but it was one long vesture, so woven to have an aperture for the neck." So, Jesus' garment seamless, the high priest's garment seamless. And the fact that the garment wasn't torn. Jesus' garments weren't torn, and the high priest's garments weren't supposed to be torn. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 10 says, "The high priest who is chief among his brothers, on whose head the anointing oil is poured, and who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose, nor tear his clothes." The idea of Jesus as a high priest is going to be explained in much more detail in the book of Hebrews. John has some passages that also seem to suggest something similar. Is this one of them? Is that what John's getting at by giving us these details about Jesus' clothing? Perhaps. And I guess that's kind of where I am for now. Maybe that's what's being communicated here. Jesus is the high priest, and even his garments show that. He's going to be the better high priest than the abusive high priest that the Jews currently had. Casting lots for Jesus' clothing had been prophesied in Psalm chapter 22, verse 18. So you notice Psalm 22 keeps coming up. That verse says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Verse 25 through 27. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own house. Matthew records the name of three specific women who were present at this crucifixion scene: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, or Joses, and Zebedee's wife, mother to James and John. It also mentions, quote, many women who were there who followed and ministered to Jesus in Galilee during his ministry. John and Mark's Gospels then give us a bit more information. John chapter 15, verse 40 says, another woman named Salome was present. And then John chapter 19, verse 25 records the presence of Jesus' mother, her sister, Jesus' aunt, and then Mary, the wife of Clopas. It's really hard. I think it's hard to lock down exactly who was there because there might be some overlap in these characters, and the commas that are there in the text make it somewhat hard to figure out if something is a descriptor of another woman or if it's talking about a unique character. And my mom actually caught one thing I said in Matthew that made me had to go back and think about it. And it's hard to say exactly which women were there because there might be some overlap here because the names and the descriptors are different across the different gospels. So, but there's a few that we know for sure were there. It's difficult to imagine, just how horrible it would be for Mary and Mary's sister, really all of them who had loved Jesus so much, to stand here and to watch this scene play out. And even here in Jesus' intense agony, we see Jesus caring for other people, which I think is pretty incredible. I lost my spot. He wanted to ensure that his mother was cared for even after he was gone, because he knew that he would be resurrecting, but soon ascending back to his Father. And so he looks to the apostle who he loved, which we know is a reference to the apostle John. And he entrusts the care of his mother to John, and it says that she went and she lived with John from that time on. This is part of the reason that we think Joseph was probably dead at this point. And a lot of biblical interpreters take it that way, that Joseph was probably dead. Because if Joseph had been alive, Joseph meaning Jesus' earthly father, if he had been alive, Mary could have just stayed with him and he would have taken care of her. But Jesus entrusts the care of his mother to John instead. And so it seems like Joseph is out of the picture. And I thought about that a little bit, and I thought of something I find curious and informative. It's interesting to me that John must have known a lot about Jesus. Mary came and lived with him, and he probably would have known all kinds of things about Jesus' upbringing, what he was like as a kid. He would have learned these things over time, and he had conversations with Mary, what he was like back then, and just all kinds of stuff, right? And he doesn't choose to include any of that stuff in his gospel, which I find interesting. And because we all have curiosities, right, about the first 30 years of Jesus' life. But he doesn't include that. And I think that tells us that the Bible is not just a book that's intended to inform all of our curiosities. It's a book that's specifically written to communicate some very important facts about Jesus' work on earth to bring redemption to mankind, and the fact that he came. There's evidence to believe he was who he said he was, and there's background to show why he had to come. And then when he had fulfilled his mission, he went back to his Father, right? That's the point of the Bible. It's not just to give us all the interesting details that we want to know about the world as it was hundreds, thousands of years ago. If that was the case, they would spend less time on genealogies, more time talking about dinosaurs, which I wouldn't complain about necessarily, but it communicates something about the reason behind the writing of the scriptures. Because if I had written it, that's just something I come up with, I would have included all those interesting details. John does not. Verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, "To fulfill the scriptures, I thirst." Sometime later, when Jesus knew that he had accomplished almost everything that needed to be accomplished, he cried out, "I thirst." John tells us that this was a fulfillment of an Old Testament scripture. He doesn't give us the specific one. It might have been Psalm chapter 22, verse 15. Psalm 22 coming up again. "My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death." Talking about his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth, right? His mouth is dry. It could be Psalm 69, verse 21. "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink." We're going to see here in verse 29 through 30 that sour wine is what was given to him. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. The drink that was given to Jesus was probably something known as Pascha. And this is not something I'd ever heard about until I had studied for this chapter. Pascha. Pascha was a mixture of wine vinegar and water. So wine that had gone bad or that had turned to like vinegar, that hard, vinegar, that harsh taste. Any of that stuff, that bad wine or wine that had gone bad, could be made into this vinegar. And then that was used, and it was mixed with water. And that sounds kind of gross, right? If you've ever tasted vinegar before, you're probably like, that sounds disgusting. I'd just rather drink plain water. But evidently, this was very popular, and it's actually very well attested to by Roman historians. Celsus writes about this, Suetonius writes about this, and there's several other references. We know that the Roman soldiers were actually given vinegar rations, and this is what they did with it. They would mix these two things together, and they drank it. So yeah, that's probably what the sour wine was. And there was a potential recipe for this online. 2 tablespoons of red wine vinegar for every cup of water. And then, as was done in the Roman times, sometimes herbs would be added for a unique taste, like coriander seed. And some other things were mentioned in the historical writings that they added to make the taste better. But I was going to go get some red wine vinegar at the store and then make it, and I forgot to do it. So maybe in chapter 20, I'll do that, and we'll give it a try. Maybe it's not as bad as I imagine. I just know what vinegar tastes like, and it's not very pleasant. This wine was sour wine was put on a hyssop branch and was lifted up to Jesus. I have a picture there of some hyssop branches. After tasting the sour wine, Jesus said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and died. He had repeatedly told his followers that he had come to do the Father's will, and that was now complete, at least in the majority of it. It was God's will and Jesus' desire to be a sacrifice for people's sins, to make it possible for people to have eternal life with God. And sin demanded a punishment. People had sinned, and God's justice demanded a punishment. And Jesus took that punishment on himself. And now all people who believe in him and are in him benefit by being forgiven, by not having to face the punishment, because Jesus stepped in to save them. So Jesus saved us by not saving himself from the cross. And now he says it was finished. The work was complete. 33 years had culminated in a cross, and the Lamb's blood was spilled so that the wrath of God could pass over all of those who believe in Jesus. Jesus had done a lot of the things that he had promise that he had talked about. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And now Jesus had made a way to the Father for people. He'd opened the door to eternal life. He had said in John 10, verse 9, I am the door. He acted as the good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep, John chapter 10, verse 11. And he was now the life-giving vine. In him, people could have life, like he talked about in John chapter 15, verse 1. Jesus still had work to do on earth. Obviously, we can't forget about the resurrection. That's key and vital. But I think it's fair to say that the hard part was now finished. Verse 31. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies could not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, or would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. I need another drink. As we mentioned earlier, it wasn't uncommon for the Roman soldiers to expedite the death of criminals on the cross. One of the ways was by breaking their legs. I was reading and I found out that it's not breathing in that's a problem when you're on the cross. It's actually exhaling. Again, from the article, The Science of the Crucifixion, they write, quote, normally to breathe in, the diaphragm must move down. This enlarges the chest cavity and air automatically moves into the lungs, inhalation. To exhale, the diaphragm rises up, which compresses the air in the lungs and forces the air out, or exhalation. As Jesus hangs on the cross, the weight of his body pulls down on the diaphragm, and the air moves into his lungs and remains there. Jesus must push up on his nailed feet, causing more pain to exhale. So if your legs are broken, I don't know if you can still push up or not, but it's going to be excruciatingly painful, and so you're going to suffocate eventually. It's going to hasten that process. The Jews approached Pilate and they asked if he would permit this, brutal form of mercy. It was a form of mercy in a way, but Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation, which was the 14th. You can go up and reference that chart that we looked at in the last video. He's crucified on the day of preparation, the 14th. The Jews wanted the body off of the cross by sunset, which then it would be the 15th. It would be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a holy convocation. No work was supposed to be done on that day. So they wanted the bodies off the cross because they wouldn't be able to do anything about them on the 15th. And also probably because on their holy day they didn't want people screaming in pain and in agony on a cross. That's not really a visual that most of us would want on a holiday. And so the Jews needed to bring these people down off the cross before sunset. Verse 32 through 34. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he had already died. He was already dead. And they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. So Pilate gives his permission for their legs to be broken, and the soldiers start breaking legs. They come to the first criminal, they break his legs, which that would be just horrible. You know how hard you have to hit somebody to break their legs? It'd be terrible. It's hard to even imagine people doing this to other people. First criminal's legs are broken. Second criminal's legs are broken. They come to Jesus and they don't break his legs because he's already dead. To ensure that Jesus was dead, the soldier took a spear and pierced Jesus' side. Like we talked about, probably piercing Jesus' heart or somewhere close to his heart. And no doubt, they were probably pretty good at this because from what I was reading from history, they weren't allowed to leave their post until the crucified victims were dead. So they were probably pretty proficient at killing people pretty quickly with tactics like this. And so that would have confirmed, if you stab somebody in the heart with your spear, that would pretty much confirm that they were dead. It says blood and water came out. there's actually a good explanation for both of those liquids. Blood is kind of obvious, right? Because if you're piercing somebody's heart or really anywhere, blood is going to come out. But what about the water? Where's this fluid come from? The water may have come from the pericardium. And I'm not a doctor. I was looking at several sources to try to figure this out. So it's not just... all this is just research that I've done. Not that I know it off the top of my head. The pericardium is a sac that encloses and protects and keeps the heart in place. And there's certain factors that can cause that sac to fill with fluid. And it's really dangerous when the pericardium fills up with fluid. It's known as pericardial effusion. And according to the Mayo Clinic's website, pericardial effusion is the buildup of excess fluid in the sac-like structure around the heart. The pericardium has two layers. The space between the layers normally contains a thin layer of fluid, but if the pericardium is diseased or injured, the resulting inflammation can lead to excess fluid. Fluid can also build up around the heart without inflammation, such as from bleeding after chest trauma. Well, there's not really any question that Jesus has been through some trauma in the last few hours. Not only the beatings that he's received from the Romans and the Jews, he's had a sleepless night on top of that, and then he has to carry this cross beam, and then he's also flogged. That would have been the greatest trauma of all, and then he's been nailed to this cross, and he's been hanging there for some time. So, I think there's been some trauma in this situation. So this is a possibility. And I have there in your notes a picture of the heart's location, and what the pericardium looks like in a healthy state, also what it looks like when the sac fills with a bunch of fluid. And that's dangerous because it puts pressure on the heart. And there's some people who think Jesus died so quick because he died from a heart attack. Because if all of this fluid had built up around his heart, it could have had fatal consequences on his cardiovascular system, and that may have been why he died. Again, I'm not a doctor. I don't know that anyone's ever going to be able to know for sure, but that is suggested. And so, if you pierce the heart, you would have to go through the pericardium, and that would explain the fluid and the water and the blood. A lot has been made about these two liquids, and there's no question that water and blood are probably the two most important liquids in all of the New Testament, or really all the Bible, water and blood. And some people take that and they say, oh, well, this is symbolic for something. Some people say the water is symbolic for baptism, the blood is symbolic for the Lord's Supper. Other people say that the water represents life and then the blood represents redemption. Personally, I haven't found a parallel that I'm really confident about. And so I'll just kind of leave that there for you to think about. Perhaps those represent something, or perhaps John's just kind of giving us the facts of the situation. Verse 35 through 37. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may believe. For these things took place, that the scripture might be fulfilled. No, not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. In verse 35, John kind of reaffirms that what he's telling people is true. Maybe some people might have been prone to doubt. That's pretty common. So John reaffirms, he's like, look, I was an eyewitness to these things. Not all the gospel writers were eyewitnesses to these things. Some of them got this knowledge secondhand. Some of them got this from sources. All of them got it from the Holy Spirit, which is why all their stories are don't contradict each other. The Holy Spirit guided all of this process, but not all of them could say, I was standing there at the cross. John could. He was literally standing there with Jesus' mother, watching her son die. And so this wasn't hearsay. The soldiers not breaking Jesus' legs was significant because it paralleled the Passover lamb. It paralleled God's instructions for how that Passover lamb was supposed to be eaten. So 1,500 years ago when the Passover was instituted, the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt. The last plague of the 10 was coming on Egypt. God told them about the Passover, and when they killed the lamb for the Passover meal, they weren't supposed to break any of its any of its bones in general. Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, "And you shall not break any of its bones." It's therefore significant that Jesus' bones weren't broken, because symbolically we've talked about how he is the Passover lamb. His blood saves us from God's wrath. So it's one more picture, one more foreshadowing from the Old Testament that we see fulfilled in Jesus' death. John then also talks about a prophecy that relates to the soldiers piercing Jesus with the spear. This one, John says, quote, "They will look on him whom they have pierced." Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, which is an Old Testament book towards the end of the Old Testament, that was kind of redundant, it says this, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him, as one weeps over a firstborn." I think when we look at all of these prophecies that John has brought up, and there's a lot, especially in Matthew too, we should just take a moment and appreciate all of these and what it would have taken for all of these verses to have their fulfillments in Jesus' death. In this moment that Jesus looks like maybe he's finally lost control. He's dead, right? Who can be in control when they're dead? Prophecies are still being fulfilled. His will is still being accomplished even though he's dead. Jesus hasn't lost control at all. And it's important to keep in mind that these men who were part of these fulfillments, the Jewish authorities, Pilate, the Roman soldiers, they were bringing about these fulfillments and not even knowing it. I mean, they weren't Jesus' friends. They weren't on Jesus' side. And I think it's a statement about the incredible power and sovereignty and control over the world that God has, and the fact that he can use these people who think they're resisting God to actually bring about what needs to happen and what he desires to happen. Verse 38 and 39. We're almost there. Oh, let me check my time here. Okay. "After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. And so he came, and he took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight." So here we're introduced to a new disciple, Joseph of Arimathea. He was a follower of Jesus, but he was secretly, because he was afraid of what the Jews would do to him. We already read that they were casting people out of the synagogue back in chapter 9. And the Jewish authorities had significant power to do damage to people, probably not only in their spiritual life, but also in their communal life and maybe even in their business life. We know that Joseph wasn't the only secret disciple. And Matthew chapter 27 informs us that Joseph was very rich, and he actually owned the tomb that they put Jesus in. It says it was his own tomb. Luke chapter 23, verse 50 says that he was a member of, quote, the council. And that's probably a reference to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So seems like he might have been a Pharisee and Sadducee himself. So again, taking big risks to publicly care for the body of Christ. Now there's another individual here who's kind of doing the same thing. Maybe they were emboldened by each other. And that is our favorite character from chapter 3, Nicodemus. You remember Nicodemus? He was the one who had come to Jesus at night because he had questions to ask him. And I think Nicodemus, he deserves some credit here for what he does here at the end of John's gospel. He was a Pharisee. We know he was a Pharisee. And most of his Pharisee friends really didn't like Jesus. And he probably came to Jesus at night in chapter 3 because he didn't want people to know that he was kind of curious about Jesus' message. But now, he's publicly honoring Jesus by burying him. And I think it's interesting that we know for certain that the sun hadn't gone down yet, because it was still the 14th day. Sun hadn't gone down yet, so he's in the light when he's taking Jesus' body and helping with this burial. And we know that the Jewish leaders knew where Jesus was buried, and they were very interested in the details of his burial. As we saw in Matthew, they set a guard over Jesus' tomb. So they know where Jesus is being buried, and it seems it's very bold that Nicodemus would do this, because it seems very unlikely that they aren't aware that Nicodemus is helping, right? And he's probably also with Joseph of Arimathea, putting his livelihood and the respect of his colleagues in danger here. But isn't it kind of cool? Jesus has talked so much about the light and coming to the light, coming out of darkness into the light. Isn't it kind of cool that we, in a physical sense, see a man bring his convictions from the dark in chapter 3 in the beginning of the book into the light in chapter 20 at the end of the book? I think it's pretty cool. And so together with Joseph and Nicodemus, they buried Jesus in a tomb that was located close to Golgotha. And the tomb's proximity to the place of Jesus' death is important, because remember, they're kind of in a hurry here. They got to get him off and buried by sunset, and they even spend some time wrapping him, and they brought some spices that they probably would have wrapped into the burial garments. The tomb it wouldn't have been like a cemetery like we think of, but it would have been a tomb that was almost like a cave cut out of the rock. And then a large stone was rolled in front of the tomb, probably to keep people, grave robbers out, and any animals who had attempted to get in there. And it says that Nicodemus brought 75 pounds of spices, that's a lot of spices. But masking the smell, and just out of respect for the person that they were burying. So that brought us through. I feel like I left a few verses off here. Let me check really quick, make sure I didn't. I thought there were like 43 verses in that chapter. 19. Oh, there are. I think I missed something here. Oh, I just didn't include Okay, I kind of covered the information in the notes, but I forgot to add the last couple verses into the text, or into my notes. So let me read those. Verses 40 through 42. So they took the body of Jesus, and they bound it in linen cloths with spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Yeah, so we kind of talked about those points. The proximity to the tomb was important, and they were kind of in a rush, and they gave him as much honor as they could give him. And then we'll see in chapter 20 that there are some other women who are going to come back and care for the body even more. Except they're going to be surprised when there's not a body there. Talk about that in the next chapter. So thank you, everybody. I know this has kind of been a long video, but had a lot of notes there, and I felt like it was good information. Hopefully you did as well. I will talk to you in a few days to do chapter 20. Take care until then. See you all later.